Judge Martha Elderfield's gavel froze mid-strike as the massive black bear padded silently into her courtroom, his 320-pound frame filling the doorway like a living shadow. The 3-year-old girl clutching his thick fur wasn't what anyone expected to see in a murder trial. Gasps erupted from the gallery as court officers reached for their weapons, chairs scraping against marble floors in a symphony of panic. The bear's dark eyes swept the room with unsettling intelligence before settling protectively beside the tiny witness stand. Dorothy Fitzgerald's weathered hands pressed against her heart, remembering how her granddaughter Emma hadn't spoken a single word since that terrible night 3 months ago. Now the child was whispering secrets into the bear's ear with the urgency of someone finally finding their voice. "Your Honor," Prosecutor Rachel Martinez called out, her voice cutting through the chaos, "the child will only speak to the bear." Who would believe that justice might depend on whatever a traumatized little girl was telling a wild animal? And what truth was so terrible that it took a bear to unlock it? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The sleepy town of Cedar Falls, Montana had never seen anything like this. Nestled between the Glacier National Park's towering peaks and endless wheat fields, the community of 8,000 souls lived by simple rules. Neighbors helped neighbors, children were everyone's responsibility, and justice meant looking out for the innocent. Today, those values would be tested in ways nobody could have imagined. Dorothy Dot Fitzgerald sat in the front row of the courthouse, her arthritis-gnarled fingers clutching a worn leather purse that had belonged to her own mother. At 74, she'd buried 2 husbands, raised 4 children, and taught 3rd grade for 43 years. Nothing had prepared her for this moment. Her granddaughter Emma, barely 3 years old, sat 20 feet away beside a creature that should have been in the wilderness, not in Judge Elderfield's courtroom. The bear, Bruno, had arrived in Cedar Falls 6 weeks ago as part of an experimental therapy program for traumatized children. Frank Kowalski, a gruff 68-year-old Marine veteran, had driven the animal transport trailer from a rehabilitation facility in Wyoming. Frank's weathered face told stories of Vietnam and Afghanistan, but losing his grandson Tyler to an IED 3 years ago had broken something inside him that even the Corps couldn't fix. Training therapy animals had become his salvation, and Bruno was his most remarkable success. Emma Thompson's world had shattered on a June evening when she witnessed something no child should ever see. Her mother, Sarah, a dedicated ICU nurse at Cedar Falls General Hospital, lay unconscious in that same hospital now, fighting for her life after what police called a brutal assault. The official report stated that Marcus Webb, a drifter with a history of violence, had attacked Sarah during a robbery. Emma had hidden under her bed, watching through the crack in her bedroom door as her mother was beaten unconscious. Since that night, Emma hadn't spoken to anyone. Not to the child psychologists, not to the social workers, not even to grandmother Dot, who had moved heaven and earth to gain temporary custody. The little girl would draw obsessively, dark, chaotic scribbles that her therapist Dr. Michael Harrison called trauma art. But when Bruno arrived, something shifted. The massive black bear, trained to comfort soldiers with PTSD, somehow reached the frightened child in ways no human could. Judge Martha Elderfield had presided over this courthouse for 45 years, building a reputation for fairness and wisdom. As a grandmother of 8 herself, she understood the sacred duty to protect children. But allowing a wild animal to serve as an intermediary for a key witness, it challenged every legal precedent she'd ever known. The prosecution argued that Emma was the only eyewitness to her mother's assault, and if she would only communicate through the bear, then perhaps the court needed to evolve with the times. The defense team from Seattle saw it differently. They called it a circus, a desperate attempt to manipulate the jury's emotions with an unprecedented legal stunt. The night it happened, Emma had been coloring at her little table in the living room while her mother Sarah finished charting patient notes from her laptop on the kitchen counter. It was their routine. Quiet evening hours together after Sarah's long shifts at the hospital. The June air was warm, windows open to catch the mountain breeze that carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. Emma remembered the sound of heavy footsteps on the porch, different from the mailman's familiar shuffle or Grandmother Dot's careful approach. These steps were deliberate, angry. When the knock came, it wasn't the polite tap of neighbors, but an aggressive pounding that made the screen door rattle in its frame. "Sarah Thompson?" The man's voice was rough, demanding. Emma looked up from her coloring book, a princess with a purple dress that she'd been carefully staying within the lines of, and watched her mother's face change. The gentle expression she wore when reading bedtime stories hardened into something Emma had never seen before. Fear. "I'm sorry, but it's late," Sarah called through the door, her voice steady despite the tremor Emma noticed in her hands. "If you need medical attention, the hospital emergency room is just 10 minutes down Highway 2. The man laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laughter that came during their Saturday morning pancake breakfasts. This sound made Emma's stomach feel sick, like when she ate too much Halloween candy. "I'm not here for medical attention, nurse. I'm here because you've been asking too many questions." Emma watched her mother's laptop screen flicker as Sarah's hand moved to close it. In that blue glow, Emma saw something she would draw over and over in the weeks to come, the reflection of absolute terror in her mother's eyes. "Emma, baby," Sarah whispered, never taking her gaze from the door, "I need you to go to your room and hide under your bed. Right now, stay there until Mama comes to get you, no matter what you hear." But Emma was 3, and 3-year-olds don't always follow directions perfectly. She crept to her bedroom but left the door cracked open, peeking through the gap like she did on Christmas morning. She watched the man force his way inside, watched her mother try to run, watched the struggle that would replay in her nightmares for months. The man wasn't Marcus Webb, though that's who the police would arrest 2 days later based on circumstantial evidence and a convenient criminal history. This man was taller, cleaner, wearing clothes that Emma's grandmother would have called respectable. He spoke in measured tones even as he grabbed Sarah by the wrist. "The Harrison Children's Files," he said, and Emma noticed he pronounced each word very carefully. "You accessed them. You printed them. Where are the copies?" Emma didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. It was the same voice the mean older boy at daycare used when he wanted to take her toys. Sarah struggled, trying to reach the phone on the kitchen counter. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah gasped, but the man shook his head like he was disappointed in a student who hadn't studied for a test. "Dr. Harrison has been very patient with your curiosity, Sarah, but patience has limits." That's when the violence began. Emma pressed her tiny hands over her ears but couldn't block out the sounds. The crash of the coffee table overturning, her mother's cry of pain, the terrible thud when Sarah's head hit the hardwood floor. Through it all, Emma stayed frozen under her bed, remembering every detail with the horrible clarity that trauma burns into memory. The man searched the house methodically, opening drawers and rifling through papers. Emma heard him in her mother's bedroom, in the home office, even in the bathroom medicine cabinet. When he finally left, Sarah lay unconscious on the living room floor, blood seeping from a head wound onto the colorful braided rug Grandmother Dot had made the Christmas before. Emma waited. Minutes stretched into an hour. She whispered for her mama, but got no response. Finally, driven by thirst and the need to use the bathroom, she crept out from under the bed. Seeing her mother's still form, she did what any 3-year-old would do. She tried to wake her up. "Mama, wake up," she whispered, patting Sarah's cheek with small hands. "Mama, I'm scared." When that didn't work, Emma curled up beside her mother on the floor and waited for someone to come help them. She was found there 18 hours later when Grandmother Dot arrived for their usual Sunday morning pancake breakfast and discovered the door standing open. From that day forward, Emma stopped talking to people, but she never stopped remembering. Every face, every word, every terrible detail was locked inside her 3-year-old mind, waiting for someone or something she felt safe enough to tell. That someone turned out to be a 320-pound black bear named Bruno. The controversy began before Bruno even set foot in the courthouse. By 7 in the morning, protesters had gathered on the courthouse steps, their handmade signs declaring, "Animals don't belong in court," and "Justice, not circus acts." Counter-protesters held signs reading, "Let Emma speak," and "Trust the bear." The national media had descended on Cedar Falls overnight, transforming the quiet mountain town into a battleground of legal precedent and public opinion. Defense attorney James Morrison, flown in from Seattle by his wealthy clients, stood before Judge Elderfield's bench like a man facing an avalanche. His perfectly pressed suit and Harvard Law credentials meant nothing in the face of what he called the most ridiculous legal maneuver he'd witnessed in 25 years of practice. "Your Honor," Morrison declared, his voice carrying the authority of expensive legal education, "this is not a therapy session, this is a court of law. The prosecution cannot parade a wild animal through these proceedings and call it justice. The precedent alone would be catastrophic. What's next? Consulting palm readers? Reading tea leaves?" Prosecutor Rachel Martinez rose from her table, her own credentials from University of Montana Law School perhaps less prestigious, but her conviction absolute. As a single mother herself, she understood the desperation that drove families to try anything to reach a traumatized child. "Your Honor, we're not asking the bear to take an oath or deliver a closing argument. We're simply requesting that the court recognize that this child has found her voice through an unconventional but scientifically supported therapy method." Judge Elderfield removed her reading glasses and studied the packed courtroom. In 45 years on the bench, she'd seen domestic violence cases destroy families, watched children's testimony unravel under pressure, and witnessed the system fail its most vulnerable citizens too many times to count. Her own granddaughter had been sexually abused by a family friend, and the trauma had stolen the girl's voice for months. Traditional therapy had failed until an art therapist helped unlock her pain through drawings. "Dr. Harrison," the judge called to the child psychologist sitting in the gallery, "please approach the bench." Dr. Michael Harrison rose smoothly, his gentle demeanor and kind eyes reflecting the compassion that had made him Cedar Falls' most trusted child therapist. His reputation for working with traumatized children was impeccable, built over 15 years of dedicated service. Parents throughout Montana sought his help when their children faced unspeakable trauma. "Doctor, in your professional opinion, is this child capable of providing reliable testimony?" Judge Elderfield asked. Dr. Harrison's voice carried the weight of clinical authority as he spoke. "Your Honor, Emma Thompson has suffered severe psychological trauma resulting in selective mutism. However, her cognitive abilities remain intact. The bear has somehow created a safe space where she feels protected enough to vocalize her memories. While unconventional, I believe her testimony could be reliable if proper safeguards are implemented." What the courtroom didn't know was that Dr. Harrison had his own reasons for wanting Emma to speak. For weeks, he'd been carefully probing during their therapy sessions, trying to determine exactly what she remembered from that night. His gentle questions about the bad man and what Emma saw had been met with stubborn silence, leaving him uncertain about how much she could identify. Frank Kowalski stood when the judge called him forward. The old Marine's weathered hands showed the calluses of a man who'd worked with animals for decades, but they trembled slightly as he spoke about Bruno's training and capabilities. Your Honor, I've worked with military dogs, police canines, and therapy animals for 30 years. Bruno here isn't just any bear. He was rescued as a cub from an illegal breeding operation and hand-raised by specialists. He's been trained specifically for this type of work, helping traumatized individuals find their voice. The bond he's formed with Emma isn't magic or mysticism, it's science. Morrison scoffed audibly. Science? Your Honor, we're talking about a wild animal that could maul everyone in this courtroom. The insurance liability alone should preclude this absurd request. Dorothy Fitzgerald had remained silent throughout the legal arguments, but now she stood with the determination of a woman who'd raised 4 children and buried 2 husbands. Her voice, strengthened by decades of commanding third-grade classrooms, carried clearly through the courtroom. Your Honor, may an old woman speak her piece? When the judge nodded, Dot continued, I've watched my granddaughter suffer in silence for 3 months. Not the doctors, not the therapists, not even me could reach her. But that bear there, he gave her back her voice. Now, I don't pretend to understand all the legal mumbo-jumbo, but I know what I've seen. Emma trusts Bruno the way she trusted her mama before this terrible thing happened. If you take that away from her, you might as well be silencing her again. The packed gallery murmured agreement, and Judge Elderfield banged her gavel for order. The case had already attracted national attention, with legal scholars debating animal-assisted testimony on morning talk shows and social media exploding with #JusticeForEmma hashtags. As the debate raged, Emma sat quietly in the witness waiting room with Bruno beside her. The bear's massive presence seemed to create a bubble of calm around the little girl. She'd brought her crayons and was drawing on a legal pad Frank had provided, not the chaotic scribbles that had characterized her art since the attack, but deliberate, detailed images. The first drawing showed a house with broken windows. The second depicted a man in a white coat, but not the rough clothing the police had described Marcus Webb wearing. The third showed herself hiding under a bed, watching through a crack in the door, but it was the fourth drawing that would change everything. A man's face, rendered with the startling accuracy that sometimes emerges from traumatic memory, showing features that belonged to someone in that very courthouse. Dr. Harrison checked his watch nervously. He'd recommended bringing Emma to court gradually, allowing her to adjust to the environment before testifying. What he hadn't anticipated was how quickly her bond with Bruno might unlock memories he'd hoped would remain buried. His weekly therapy sessions with Emma had been carefully designed to monitor her recovery and ensure certain details stayed forgotten. When court reconvened, Judge Elderfield's decision would set precedent that legal scholars would debate for decades. After careful consideration of all arguments and precedents, this court will allow the child to provide testimony with the bear present as emotional support. However, strict protocols will be observed. The bear will remain at all times under the control of his handler, Mr. Kowalski. Any sign of distress or danger will result in immediate removal. Morrison's objection was immediate and vehement, but the judge's gavel silenced his protest. Outside the courthouse, news vans prepared to broadcast the unprecedented moment when a 3-year-old girl would take the witness stand accompanied by a 320-pound black bear. None of them suspected that the truth Emma was about to reveal would expose a conspiracy that reached far beyond a simple assault case. The first day of testimony began with Emma's tiny hand resting on Bruno's massive head as she approached the witness stand. The bear moved with deliberate calm, his trained gait steady and reassuring. Frank Kowalski walked beside them, his weathered face betraying none of the anxiety that gripped the courtroom. Judge Elderfield had ordered the gallery cleared of photographers, but sketch artists worked frantically to capture the unprecedented scene. Emma climbed onto the specially modified witness chair, her legs dangling like a child on a swing set. Bruno positioned himself beside her, close enough that she could reach out and touch his fur whenever fear threatened to overwhelm her small frame. The bear's dark eyes scanned the courtroom with an alertness that made several spectators shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Emma," Prosecutor Rachel Martinez began gently, kneeling beside the witness stand so she wouldn't tower over the child. "Can you tell us your name?" For several minutes, Emma remained silent, her fingers working through Bruno's thick coat. Then, in a whisper so soft the court reporter had to strain to hear, she spoke to the bear. "Tell them I'm Emma Grace Thompson. Tell them I'm 3 years old." Rachel exchanged glances with Judge Elderfield. "Emma, can you tell Bruno what happened the night your mama got hurt?" Emma buried her face in Bruno's fur for a long moment. When she lifted her head, her eyes held a clarity that seemed far beyond her years. "There was a bad man," she whispered to Bruno. "He came to our house when it was dark. He hurt Mama because she found something she wasn't supposed to find." Defense Attorney Morrison leaned forward, already formulating objections, but Judge Elderfield's stern look kept him seated. The child's testimony, while unconventional, was clearly voluntary and uncoached. "What did your mama find, sweetheart?" Rachel asked. Emma reached into her small backpack and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, a crude drawing she'd made that morning. She showed it to Bruno first, as if seeking his approval, then handed it to Rachel. The drawing depicted stick figures of children, all with sad faces, standing behind bars. "Mama found the pictures of the sad children," Emma said, her voice growing slightly stronger. "The bad man was angry because Mama was trying to help them." Dr. Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his kind facade wavering for just a moment. He'd spent weeks trying to determine what Emma remembered, always careful to frame his questions as therapeutic exploration rather than interrogation. Now he realized the child had been holding back far more than anyone suspected. Over the following days, Emma's testimony unfolded like pieces of a complex puzzle. She spoke only to Bruno, but her words carried clearly through the hushed courtroom. She described the man who'd attacked her mother with disturbing accuracy, his height, his voice, the way he moved through their house with familiarity that suggested he'd been there before. "He knew where Mama kept her work papers," Emma told Bruno during the second day of testimony. "He knew which drawer had the important stuff. He wasn't looking around like a stranger would." Dorothy Fitzgerald watched from the gallery, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, as her granddaughter found the courage to speak truths that had been locked inside her small heart for months. Beside her sat other family members who'd driven from across Montana to support Emma, cousins, aunts, and uncles who formed a protective circle around their loved ones. The prosecution presented evidence that began to paint a picture far more complex than the simple assault case it had appeared to be. Sarah Thompson's laptop had been found with files deleted just hours before the attack. Her supervisor at Cedar Falls General Hospital confirmed that Sarah had been asking questions about unusual patient transfers involving children, specifically children who'd been treated by Dr. Harrison's practice. Frank Kowalski testified about Bruno's unique training, explaining how the bear had been taught to recognize signs of distress and respond with protective behavior. "Bruno's not just providing comfort," Frank explained to the jury. "He's creating a safe zone where truth can emerge. In my 30 years working with traumatized individuals, I've never seen anything quite like their bond." As the week progressed, Emma's drawings became increasingly detailed and specific. She drew the layout of her house with accuracy that amazed adults who'd visited the crime scene. She depicted the struggle between her mother and the attacker with disturbing precision. Most significantly, she drew faces, not just of the man who'd hurt her mother, but of other people she claimed to have seen in the sad place. "What's the sad place, Emma?" Rachel asked, during the third day of testimony. Emma looked at Bruno, her small hand stroking his ear as she gathered courage. "It's where they keep the children who don't have mamas and papas to protect them. The bad man takes pictures of them and sells them to other bad people." The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Judge Elderfield banged her gavel repeatedly, calling for order. Defense attorney Morrison jumped to his feet, objecting that the child's testimony was becoming prejudicial and beyond the scope of the assault case. But Emma wasn't finished. "Doctor Harrison comes to the sad place sometimes," she continued, her voice barely audible. "He brings new children there. He told Mama he was helping them, but he was really hurting them." Dr. Harrison's face had gone pale, his usually composed demeanor cracking like ice under spring sun. He started to rise from his seat, then caught himself, forcing a concerned expression back onto his features. "Your Honor, the child is clearly confused. The trauma has affected her ability to distinguish between reality and nightmares." Rachel Martinez felt her heart racing as pieces of a larger conspiracy began to emerge. "Emma, how do you know about this sad place? Have you been there?" Emma shook her head vigorously. "No, but Mama showed me the pictures on her computer. She was crying when she showed me. She said we had to help the children, but then the bad man came." The implications were staggering. Sarah Thompson hadn't been the victim of a random assault. She'd been silenced because she'd discovered something that threatened powerful people. Emma's testimony suggested a child trafficking operation that reached far beyond Cedar Falls, with Dr. Harrison potentially at its center. During cross-examination, Morrison attempted to discredit Emma's testimony by highlighting her age and the traumatic nature of her experience. But every time he tried to confuse or intimidate her, Bruno would shift positions slightly, placing himself between the child and the attorney. The bear's protective instincts were so pronounced that even skeptics in the jury began to believe in the authenticity of Emma's bond with the animal. "Emma," Morrison asked with forced gentleness, "isn't it possible that you're mixing up things you've seen on television with what really happened?" Emma looked at Bruno, then back at the attorney with startling directness. "Bruno knows when people are lying," she said simply. "He can smell it. You smell like lies." The gallery twittered with nervous laughter, quickly silenced by Judge Elderfield's stern gaze. Morrison's face flushed red as he struggled to maintain his composure. As the week progressed, law enforcement officials began investigating Emma's claims. Her descriptions of the sad place led detectives to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town that had recently been purchased by a shell company with ties to Dr. Harrison's medical practice. Inside, they found evidence of recent habitation by children, discarded clothing, toys, and makeshift sleeping areas that corroborated Emma's testimony. The media circus intensified daily. National news crews broadcast live from Cedar Falls, debating the ethics and legality of animal-assisted testimony. Legal scholars appeared on talk shows, arguing about precedent and constitutional issues. Social media exploded with #TeamEmma and #Trust. The bear hashtags, as the country watched a small Montana town grapple with questions that challenged fundamental assumptions about justice and truth. Dr. Harrison continued to attend court sessions, maintaining his role as Emma's therapist and concerned child advocate. But careful observers noticed subtle changes in his behavior. The way his hands trembled slightly when Emma spoke, how his eyes darted toward the exits when she described the bad doctor, and his increasing insistence that the child needed more intensive therapy to separate reality from fantasy. Emma's grandmother, Dorothy, had become an unlikely media figure, her plain-spoken defense of her granddaughter resonating with viewers across America. "That child has been through hell," she told reporters gathered on the courthouse steps. "If a bear can help her find her voice again, then praise the Lord for that bear. Some folks are so worried about following rules that they forget the whole point is protecting children. Frank Kowalski found himself defending Bruno's training and capabilities to skeptical reporters daily. "People think bears are just mindless beasts," he explained to a CBS News crew, "but they're incredibly intelligent, empathetic creatures. Bruno was hand-raised from infancy, trained specifically for this work. He's probably safer than most dogs you'd find in a courthouse." The prosecution's case was building momentum, but they knew they needed more than a 3-year-old's testimony, however compelling, to secure convictions. Rachel Martinez worked tirelessly with federal investigators who joined the case, following financial trails and interviewing other families whose children had received treatment from Dr. Harrison's practice. By Friday of the first week, the evidence picture was becoming clearer. Sarah Thompson had stumbled onto financial irregularities in the hospital's records, specifically payments from a medical research foundation that didn't seem to correspond to any legitimate research activities. Her nursing background had given her access to patient files that revealed a pattern of children being transferred to Dr. Harrison's care under suspicious circumstances. Emma's testimony had opened a door that law enforcement hadn't even known existed. But as the investigation expanded, it became clear that the conspiracy reached far beyond one small-town doctor. The shell companies, the fake research foundation, and the warehouse facility suggested an organized operation with significant financial backing and political protection. The defense team, meanwhile, was scrambling to contain the damage. They'd entered court expecting to defend Marcus Webb against simple assault charges. Now they faced a case that threatened to expose their client as a small player in a much larger criminal enterprise. Morrison's strategy shifted from discrediting Emma's testimony to limiting its scope, arguing that trafficking allegations were beyond the jurisdiction of the local court. As the first week of testimony concluded, Emma sat with Bruno in the witness waiting room, drawing pictures of her mother's face. The images showed Sarah smiling, healthy and whole, a vision of hope that sustained the little girl through the darkness of revealing terrible truths. "When will Mama wake up?" Emma asked Bruno, her small voice carrying all the weight of a child's desperate love. The bear nuzzled her gently, and somehow Emma seemed to find comfort in his wordless response. Outside, the circus of media attention continued, but in that quiet room, a traumatized child and a gentle giant had found something more valuable than justice. They'd found trust. The second week of testimony began with Emma's most detailed revelation yet. She sat beside Bruno, her small fingers working through his thick fur as she gathered the courage to speak about the night that had shattered her world. The courtroom held its collective breath as she whispered to the bear, her words carrying clearly through the hushed space. "The bad man knew where Mama kept her secret box," Emma told Bruno, her voice steady despite the weight of memory. "He went straight to the closet behind her work dresses. He knew about the hiding place under the loose board." Rachel Martinez felt her pulse quicken. This detail hadn't appeared in any police report. Sarah Thompson's personal effects had been cataloged after the assault, but investigators had focused on obvious evidence like the overturned furniture and blood spatter. They'd never discovered a hidden compartment in the bedroom closet. "What was in Mama's secret box, Emma?" Rachel asked gently. Emma reached into her backpack and pulled out another drawing, this one showing a rectangular container filled with papers and photographs. Pictures of the sad children, numbers that made Mama cry, letters from other mamas who were scared. Dr. Harrison's composure cracked visibly. His hands gripped the gallery bench until his knuckles went white, and a thin sheen of perspiration appeared on his forehead despite the courtroom's cool temperature. He'd spent months believing that Sarah's evidence had been destroyed in the assault, never suspecting that a 3-year-old had witnessed exactly where it was hidden. Judge Elderfield called for a brief recess, during which law enforcement officials raced to the Thompson house with a search warrant. Within 2 hours, they'd discovered the hidden compartment Emma had described, a hollowed-out section of closet floor that contained a waterproof box filled with documents that would blow the case wide open. The evidence Sarah had gathered was devastating. Financial records showed payments flowing from a medical research foundation to Dr. Harrison's practice, but the supposed research subjects were children who'd been reported missing from foster care systems across 3 states. Photographs documented horrific abuse, and correspondence revealed a network of buyers willing to pay premium prices for specific types of children. When court resumed that afternoon, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Defense attorney Morrison huddled with his client Marcus Webb, whose confused expression suggested he was beginning to understand that he'd been set up as a convenient scapegoat. Webb's criminal history made him perfect for the role, a drifter with violent tendencies who could plausibly be blamed for Sarah's assault. Emma continued her testimony with heartbreaking clarity, describing how her mother had shown her some of the photographs, explaining in age-appropriate terms that some children didn't have safe homes and needed help. "Mama said we were going to tell the police about the bad people," Emma whispered to Bruno. "But then the bad man came and hurt Mama before we could help the sad children." The emotional impact on the courtroom was profound. Several jurors wiped away tears, and even the stenographer paused to compose herself. Dorothy Fitzgerald sobbed openly in the gallery, finally understanding the full scope of what her daughter-in-law had discovered and the courage it had taken to try to expose it. Frank Kowalski watched Bruno's behavior with growing concern. The bear had been trained to provide comfort and stability, but his protective instincts were becoming increasingly pronounced. Every time certain people in the courtroom moved or spoke, Bruno would position himself more defensively around Emma, his massive body creating an impenetrable barrier between the child and perceived threats. The breakthrough came when Emma began describing the man who'd attacked her mother in greater detail. Her artistic ability, remarkable for a 3-year-old, had captured facial features with startling accuracy. As she spoke to Bruno about the bad man's eyes and the way he smiled when he was hurting people, her descriptions began to paint a picture that didn't match Marcus Webb at all. "He had clean hands," Emma told Bruno, holding up her own small fingers to demonstrate. "Not like the man who fixes our fence. Clean hands, like Dr. Harrison." The courtroom erupted. Dr. Harrison bolted to his feet, his carefully maintained facade finally crumbling completely. "This is preposterous," he shouted. "The child is clearly delusional. I've been treating her trauma for months. I would never harm a patient's family." But his outburst only served to reinforce Emma's testimony. Bruno immediately went into full protective mode, rising to his full height and positioning himself between Emma and the source of the shouting. The bear's low growl reverberated through the courthouse, a sound that made everyone freeze in primal recognition of barely contained power. Judge Elderfield banged her gavel repeatedly, calling for order, but the damage was done. Dr. Harrison's violent reaction to Emma's words had revealed more about his guilt than hours of careful cross-examination could have achieved. Emma, remarkably calm despite the chaos around her, continued speaking to Bruno as if nothing had happened. "He's the one who comes to the sad place," she said simply. "He's the one who takes pictures of the children and sells them to bad people far away." Rachel Martinez rose to address the court, her voice shaking with the weight of revelation. "Your Honor, I request that Dr. Michael Harrison be taken into custody immediately. The evidence discovered this morning, combined with this child's testimony, provides probable cause to believe he was directly involved in the assault on Sarah Thompson and is the leader of a child trafficking operation." The arrest was swift and dramatic. As court officers approached Dr. Harrison, he made one final desperate attempt to discredit Emma's testimony. "She's just a baby," he screamed. "You're destroying an innocent man based on the fantasies of a traumatized child." But Emma's response, delivered with the devastating honesty that only young children possess, silenced his protests. "Bruno knows you're the bad man. He knew the first time you came to see me. That's why he always puts himself between us." Indeed, reviewing security footage from their therapy sessions revealed that Bruno had consistently displayed protective behavior around Dr. Harrison, positioning himself to shield Emma and showing signs of agitation whenever the doctor attempted to get close to her. Frank Kowalski confirmed that this behavior pattern was highly unusual for the typically gentle bear, suggesting an instinctive recognition of threat. As Dr. Harrison was led away in handcuffs, the full scope of Emma's courage became clear. For months, she'd endured therapy sessions with the very man who'd orchestrated her mother's near-fatal assault. She'd sat in his office, submitted to his psychological evaluations, and answered his carefully crafted questions while he tried to determine how much she remembered of that terrible night. The revelation sent shockwaves through the medical and legal communities. Dr. Harrison had been a respected figure in child psychology, trusted by families throughout the region to help their most vulnerable children. His betrayal of that trust was unprecedented, and the implications for other children he'd treated were staggering. Emma's grandmother Dorothy stood outside the courthouse that evening, addressing the crowd of reporters and supporters who'd gathered. Her voice, strengthened by righteous anger, carried clearly across the courthouse steps. "That monster spent months trying to get inside my grandbaby's head, trying to figure out if she could identify him. But Emma's stronger than he ever imagined, and she had Bruno protecting her every step of the way." Frank Kowalski found himself defending not just Bruno's capabilities, but the entire concept of animal-assisted therapy to skeptical reporters. "What you witnessed today wasn't magic or luck," he explained to a CNN crew. "That bear was doing exactly what he was trained to do, protecting a vulnerable child from a predator. The fact that the predator turned out to be her therapist makes it even more remarkable." The case had evolved far beyond the simple assault charges that had brought everyone to court. Federal investigators were now involved, following the evidence trail to identify other victims and co-conspirators in what appeared to be a sophisticated trafficking network. The shell companies, fake research foundations, and network of buyers suggested an operation with national scope and significant financial resources. Marcus Webb, the man originally charged with Sarah's assault, was quietly released as investigators focused their attention on the real perpetrators. His confusion and relief were palpable as he realized he'd been chosen as a scapegoat precisely because his criminal history made him an easy target for prosecution. That night, Emma sat with Bruno in the courthouse family room, drawing pictures of her mother walking and smiling. The images showed hope and healing, a child's vision of the future she desperately wanted to see. When Frank asked her if she was tired from the long day of testimony, she looked up with eyes that seemed far older than her 3 years. "Bruno says Mama will wake up soon," she told him simply. "He says the bad man can't hurt her anymore because everyone knows the truth now." As the evening wore on and the courthouse emptied, the magnitude of what had been accomplished began to sink in. A 3-year-old girl, supported by a gentle giant of a bear, had exposed a conspiracy that had destroyed countless lives. Her courage to speak truth to power, channeled through her bond with an unlikely protector, had achieved what months of traditional investigation had failed to accomplish. The climax was approaching, but already the case had changed forever. How the legal system viewed child witnesses, animal-assisted therapy, and the power of unconventional approaches to uncovering truth. The backlash came swift and merciless. Within 24 hours of Dr. Harrison's arrest, the forces protecting the trafficking network mobilized to destroy everything Emma and Bruno had accomplished. Anonymous calls flooded the courthouse, threatening Judge Elderfield's family if she continued to allow circus proceedings. The Montana State Bar received formal complaints about Rachel Martinez's unethical manipulation of a traumatized child for publicity. Most devastating of all, the State Department of Child Services received an emergency petition claiming that Emma was being exploited and re-traumatized by her continued exposure to court proceedings. The petition, filed by a prestigious law firm from Denver, demanded Emma's immediate removal from her grandmother's custody and placement in a secure facility where she could receive proper psychological treatment away from media attention and dangerous wild animals. Dorothy Fitzgerald sat in her kitchen at dawn, reading the court papers that had been served at 5 in the morning. Her weathered hands shook as she absorbed the legal language that threatened to tear Emma away from the only stable family she had left. The petition painted Dorothy as an elderly woman unable to protect her granddaughter from exploitation, suggesting that Emma's testimony was the result of coaching and manipulation rather than genuine memory. "They're trying to silence her," Frank Kowalski said grimly, reading over Dorothy's shoulder. He'd driven to the Fitzgerald house as soon as he heard about the emergency petition. Bruno sat beside him, sensing the tension in the room, his dark eyes alert and watchful. The hearing was scheduled for that afternoon, deliberately rushed to prevent adequate preparation of a defense. Emma would be required to attend, and if the judge ruled against them, she would be removed from Dorothy's home immediately. Worse still, the petition specifically requested that all contact with Bruno be terminated, claiming the bear posed an unacceptable safety risk to a vulnerable child. Emma, unaware of the legal machinations threatening to destroy her world, sat on the kitchen floor drawing pictures of her mother. In her 3-year-old mind, the truth had been told, the bad man was caught, and soon everything would return to normal. She showed Bruno each drawing, explaining in her whispered voice how happy Mama would be when she woke up and learned that the sad children were safe. The emergency hearing convened in a different courtroom with a different judge, Judge Harold Brennan, known for his strict interpretation of child welfare laws and his skepticism toward unconventional therapeutic methods. The courtroom was packed with reporters and legal observers, all sensing that this hearing would determine not just Emma's fate, but the future of animal-assisted therapy in legal proceedings. The Denver law firm had brought in Dr. Patricia Westfield, a child psychologist with impressive credentials who specialized in cases of alleged coaching and false memory syndrome. Dr. Westfield testified that Emma's detailed testimony was highly suspicious for a child her age, suggesting that she'd been prompted and rehearsed to deliver specific accusations. Children of 3 years old simply don't possess the cognitive capacity to remember complex events with the detail this child has provided, Dr. Westfield stated confidently. The so-called therapeutic relationship with a wild animal has likely created a fantasy bond that makes the child more susceptible to suggestion and manipulation. Rachel Martinez fought desperately to defend Emma's credibility, but the proceedings moved at breakneck speed. Judge Brennan seemed predetermined to rule against continued testimony, expressing concerns about traumatizing a child further for the sake of legal theatrics. The worst moment came when Bruno was ordered removed from the courthouse entirely. Frank Kowalski protested that separating Emma from the bear would cause additional trauma, but Judge Brennan was unmoved. This court will not risk a child's safety to accommodate experimental therapy methods, he declared. Emma's reaction to Bruno's removal was heartbreaking. As court officers led Frank and the bear toward the exit, Emma broke free from her grandmother's arms and ran after them, her small voice crying out in distress, "Bruno, don't leave me! Who will protect me from the bad people?" The sight of the tiny girl chasing after the massive bear, both of them being forcibly separated, created chaos in the courtroom. Several jurors from the original trial wept openly, and even hardened reporters struggled to maintain professional composure. The image would later become iconic, symbolizing a child's trust being shattered by a system meant to protect her. Dorothy Fitzgerald made one last desperate plea to Judge Brennan. Rising from her seat with the dignity of her 74 years, she addressed the court with a voice that had commanded respect in classrooms for 4 decades. Your Honor, I've raised 4 children and taught thousands more over 43 years. I know when a child is telling the truth, and I know when she's being harmed. My granddaughter found her voice through that bear, and now you're taking away the one thing that makes her feel safe. If that's not traumatizing a child, I don't know what is. But Judge Brennan had already made his decision. Emma would be removed from Dorothy's custody immediately and placed in a state facility where she could receive appropriate psychological evaluation without the influence of well-meaning but misguided family members. All contact with Bruno was prohibited, and Emma's testimony in the trafficking case was suspended pending a complete psychological review. The transfer happened within hours. Social workers arrived at Dorothy's house with police escort, taking Emma's few belongings and loading them into a state vehicle. Emma clung to her grandmother, not understanding why she was being taken away from the woman who'd been her anchor since her mother's assault. "Where's Bruno?" Emma kept asking through her tears. "I need Bruno." "Who will keep the bad people away?" The social workers, following their training, tried to reassure her that she would be safe without the bear, but Emma had learned through painful experience that adults couldn't always protect children from monsters. Only Bruno had proven himself completely trustworthy. And now, he was gone. Dorothy watched helplessly as the car carrying her granddaughter disappeared down the mountain road. The house felt impossibly empty without Emma's chatter and Bruno's gentle presence. The drawings Emma had made were scattered across the kitchen table, colorful images of hope and healing that now seemed like artifacts from a dream. At Cedar Falls General Hospital, Sarah Thompson's condition took a sudden turn for the worse. The stress of the legal proceedings, combined with the trauma of learning about her daughter's situation, caused dangerous fluctuations in her brain pressure. Doctors worked frantically to stabilize her condition, but privately admitted to Dorothy that the prognosis was grim. Frank Kowalski sat in his truck outside the state facility where Emma had been taken, Bruno beside him in the custom transport cage. The bear was clearly distressed, pacing restlessly and making low sounds of distress. Animals, Frank knew, formed bonds that transcended human understanding, and Bruno's connection to Emma was being severed by people who saw only legal precedent and bureaucratic procedure. The media coverage of Emma's removal sparked national outrage. #FreeEmma hashtags trended on social media as Americans watched a traumatized child being punished for speaking truth. Legal experts debated the case on news programs, with many arguing that the system was protecting perpetrators at the expense of victims. But the powerful forces behind the trafficking network had achieved their goal. Emma was isolated, Bruno was banned, and the key witness in the case was effectively silenced. Dr. Harrison's arrest had been a setback, but the network's political connections and financial resources were already working to minimize the damage and discredit the evidence. That night, in the sterile room of the state facility, Emma sat alone for the first time since meeting Bruno. The facility's staff were kind, but followed strict protocols that prohibited personal attachments. Emma was given crayons and paper, but her drawings now showed only dark, chaotic scribbles, the same traumatized art that had characterized her work before Bruno's arrival. The tragedy seemed complete. A 3-year-old girl who had found the courage to speak truth to power was being punished for her bravery. The bear who had helped her find her voice was locked away from her, and the conspiracy they had exposed was regrouping, using the very legal system they had corrupted to silence their accusers. But Emma Thompson was stronger than anyone realized, and her bond with Bruno transcended the artificial barriers that adults had constructed. The truth they had uncovered together would not be buried so easily, and the forces working against them had underestimated the power of a child's determination and a bear's loyalty. The darkest hour had arrived, but dawn was closer than anyone suspected. The truth began to unravel at 3 in the morning when FBI agent Sarah Chen received an encrypted file from an anonymous whistleblower. The digital package contained financial records, communication logs, and photographs that exposed the trafficking network's true scope. More shocking still, the evidence revealed that Dr. Michael Harrison was not the leader of the operation. He was merely a mid-level operative in a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of state government and federal agencies. The real mastermind was Deputy Chief Thomas Bradley of the Montana State Police, whose 30-year career in law enforcement had provided perfect cover for identifying vulnerable children and facilitating their disappearance into the trafficking pipeline. Bradley's position gave him access to foster care records, missing person reports, and crime scene evidence that he had systematically manipulated to protect the network's operations. Agent Chen's hands trembled as she reviewed photographs taken inside the abandoned warehouse where Emma had described the sad place. The images showed children's belongings, makeshift sleeping areas, and evidence of systematic abuse that corroborated every detail of Emma's testimony. But most damning of all were the security camera recordings that showed Bradley himself supervising the transportation of children to buyers across the country. The federal investigation had been proceeding parallel to the local court case, but the FBI had been unaware of how deeply the corruption penetrated local law enforcement. Bradley had been feeding information to federal agents while simultaneously covering up evidence and misdirecting investigations. His manipulation of the Marcus Webb arrest had been just one example of how he used his position to create convenient scapegoats while protecting the real perpetrators. As dawn broke over Cedar Falls, Agent Chen assembled a team of federal marshals to execute arrest warrants across 3 states. The operation, codenamed Guardian Angel in honor of Emma's courage, would simultaneously arrest 17 members of the trafficking network, including several prominent citizens whose involvement would shock their communities. Meanwhile, at the state facility where Emma was being held, night shift supervisor Margaret Holloway noticed something troubling in the child's behavior. Emma had stopped eating, stopped speaking, and spent her days creating increasingly disturbed artwork that showed faceless figures threatening small children. The facility's psychiatrist recommended immediate intervention, warning that Emma was displaying signs of severe regression that could cause permanent psychological damage. Margaret had worked with traumatized children for 20 years, and her instincts told her that separating Emma from her support system was causing more harm than protection. Against facility protocol, she called Dorothy Fitzgerald to report Emma's deteriorating condition. "Mrs. Fitzgerald," Margaret said quietly, mindful of security cameras and recording devices. "I'm not supposed to make this call, but that little girl is dying inside without her family and that bear. I've seen a lot of broken children, and Emma's breaking fast." Dorothy's voice was hoarse from crying and sleepless nights. "Can you get her out of there? Can you bring her home?" "Not legally," Margaret admitted, "but there might be another way. If Emma became medically unstable, she could be transferred to Cedar Falls General for treatment, and if she happened to encounter her therapy animal during that transfer." The plan required perfect timing and considerable risk. Margaret would document Emma's psychological decline as a medical emergency requiring immediate hospital intervention. Frank Kowalski would position Bruno near the hospital entrance, ready for what would appear to be an accidental encounter. Dorothy would be visiting her daughter Sarah at the exact moment Emma arrived for emergency psychological evaluation. At noon on Thursday, the pieces fell into place. Emma was loaded into an ambulance for transport to Cedar Falls General, her small form seeming even tinier against the white medical gurney. The paramedics were genuine medical professionals who had no knowledge of the larger plan, but they were deeply concerned about the child's catatonic state and rapid deterioration. Frank Kowalski sat in his truck outside the hospital's main entrance, Bruno in his transport cage behind him. The bear had been restless for days, pacing and vocalizing in ways that suggested deep distress. Animal behaviorists would later theorize that Bruno's bond with Emma created a form of separation anxiety typically seen only in paired animals who had been together since birth. When the ambulance arrived, Margaret Holloway made a crucial decision that would end her career, but potentially save Emma's life. As Emma was wheeled toward the hospital entrance, Margaret suddenly announced that the child was experiencing acute psychological distress and needed immediate intervention from any available therapeutic resources. This child has been traumatized by separation from her primary therapeutic support system, Margaret declared loudly enough for bystanders and media to hear. The current treatment protocol is causing demonstrable harm. Frank Kowalski didn't need further invitation. He opened Bruno's transport cage and allowed the bear to see Emma for the first time in 5 days. The reaction was immediate and profound. Bruno's distressed vocalizations transformed into soft, rumbling sounds of recognition and comfort. Emma, who had been unresponsive for hours, suddenly lifted her head and whispered the first word she'd spoken since their separation. "Bruno," she said simply, and the sound of her voice carried across the hospital parking lot like a small miracle. The reunion was captured by news cameras that had been stationed at the hospital hoping for updates on Sarah Thompson's condition. Within minutes, footage of Emma reaching toward Bruno while medical personnel looked on went viral across social media platforms. The hashtag Bruno and Emma began trending nationally as Americans watched a traumatized child find her voice again through connection with her unlikely protector. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. As federal agents executed arrest warrants across the region, they discovered that the state facility where Emma had been held was itself connected to the trafficking network. The Denver law firm that had petitioned for Emma's removal was funded by the same shell companies that financed the entire operation. Dr. Patricia Westfield, the expert who had testified against Emma's credibility, was a paid consultant whose job was to discredit child witnesses and facilitate their removal from protective families. Judge Harold Brennan, who had ordered Emma's placement in the facility, was found to have financial connections to the trafficking network through real estate investments that laundered money from child sales. His emergency ruling had been designed not to protect Emma, but to silence her before she could reveal additional details about the conspiracy. The scope of the corruption was breathtaking. The trafficking network had infiltrated child protective services, the court system, medical facilities, and law enforcement agencies. They had created a pipeline that identified vulnerable children, removed them from protective families, and delivered them to buyers while maintaining perfect legal cover through manipulated court orders and falsified psychological evaluations. Emma's case had threatened to expose the entire operation because her testimony was so detailed and credible that it couldn't be dismissed as fantasy or false memory. The network's only option had been to discredit her entirely by separating her from her support system and creating the appearance that her testimony was the result of manipulation rather than genuine memory. Agent Chen arrived at the hospital as Emma was being reunited with her grandmother and Bruno. The federal investigation had moved so quickly that local conspirators hadn't had time to coordinate their response. Within hours, arrests were made that would dismantle the trafficking operation and expose corruption that reached into the highest levels of state government. The evidence seized during the arrests included detailed records of children who had been trafficked over a 15-year period. Emma's mother, Sarah, had discovered only a small fraction of the network's activities, but her courage in attempting to expose it had ultimately led to the rescue of dozens of children and the arrest of their traffickers. Dr. Harrison's role in the conspiracy was revealed to be more complex than initially understood. He had been recruited into the network while struggling with gambling debts and had provided psychological profiles of vulnerable children in exchange for debt forgiveness and regular payments. His therapy sessions with Emma had been intelligence-gathering operations designed to determine how much she remembered and whether she posed a threat to the network's security. The revelation that Emma had been undergoing therapy with one of her mother's attackers shocked the medical community and prompted immediate reviews of patient safety protocols. Dr. Harrison's credentials were revoked, and his practice was shut down pending investigation of all children who had been under his care. As the arrests continued throughout the day, Emma sat with Bruno in a hospital room near her mother's ICU ward. The bear's presence seemed to accelerate Emma's psychological recovery, and within hours she was speaking in full sentences and creating artwork that showed hope rather than trauma. Her drawings depicted families together, children playing safely, and Bruno standing guard over happy scenes of domestic tranquility. The conspiracy that had seemed so powerful and untouchable crumbled rapidly once Emma's testimony was corroborated by federal evidence. The network's members, including Judge Brennan and Deputy Chief Bradley, were arrested in a coordinated operation that prevented them from warning each other or destroying additional evidence. Frank Kowalski sat beside Emma and Bruno, marveling at the bond that had ultimately brought down a criminal conspiracy worth millions of dollars. The gruff Marine veteran had seen combat in multiple theaters, but nothing had prepared him for the courage displayed by a 3-year-old girl and the loyalty demonstrated by a 320-pound bear. Bruno knew all along, Emma told Frank as she drew pictures of her mother walking and smiling. He could smell the bad people. That's why he always protected me from Dr. Harrison. The truth was finally emerging, but the full scope of healing would take much longer. Emma's testimony had saved dozens of children and exposed institutional corruption that had operated with impunity for over a decade. Her bond with Bruno had provided the strength necessary to speak truth to power, even when that power seemed overwhelming. The reversal was complete, but the most important reunion was yet to come. The sound that changed everything was so soft that only Bruno heard it first. The bear's massive head lifted from where he'd been resting beside Emma's hospital bed, his dark eyes focusing on something beyond human perception. His low rumble of recognition brought Emma instantly alert, her small hand reaching for his fur as she followed his gaze toward the ICU down the hallway. "Mama," Emma whispered, and for the first time in 3 months, the word carried hope instead of grief. Sarah Thompson had awakened to the sound of her daughter's laughter drifting through the hospital corridors. The doctors called it medically impossible. Patients don't emerge from medically induced comas in response to distant sounds. But Sarah's vital signs had been steadily improving since Emma's reunion with Bruno, as if the mother's healing was somehow connected to her daughter's emotional recovery. Dorothy Fitzgerald stood in the doorway between the 2 hospital rooms, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she watched 4 generations of her family come together. Her son-in-law James, Emma's father, had arrived that morning from federal witness protection. His false death had been necessary to keep him safe while he provided evidence against the trafficking network's financial operations. "Daddy!" Emma's cry of joy echoed through the hospital wing as she saw her father for the first time in over a year. James Thompson swept his daughter into his arms, his own tears mingling with hers as Bruno watched approvingly from beside the bed. The reunion that followed was tender and transformative. Sarah, though weak from her ordeal, held Emma close as the little girl chattered excitedly about Bruno, about speaking the truth in court, and about the bad people who couldn't hurt children anymore. Her vocabulary had expanded remarkably during her testimony, as if finding her voice had accelerated her development in ways that amazed the medical staff. "My brave little girl," Sarah whispered, stroking Emma's hair as Bruno positioned himself protectively beside the hospital bed. "You saved so many children, sweetheart. You and Bruno saved everyone." Frank Kowalski stood quietly in the corner, watching the family reunion with the satisfaction of a mission completed. Bruno's training had prepared him for many scenarios, but nothing had prepared Frank for the depth of bond that had developed between the bear and the little girl. The animal's protective instincts had evolved into something approaching devotion, and Emma's trust in Bruno was absolute and unshakable. Judge Martha Elderfield visited that afternoon, bringing with her a formal commendation from the Montana Supreme Court recognizing Emma's courage and Bruno's unprecedented contribution to the justice system. The precedent established by their case would lead to new legislation protecting child witnesses and expanding the use of therapy animals in legal proceedings. "Emma Grace Thompson," the judge said, kneeling beside the hospital bed, "you are the bravest person I've met in 45 years on the bench. You spoke truth when no one else could, and you helped save children across the country." Emma looked up at the judge with eyes that seemed older than her 3 years. "Bruno helped me be brave," she said simply. "He made me strong enough to tell about the bad people." The legal aftermath would continue for months as federal prosecutors built cases against the 17 network members who had been arrested. Dr. Harrison pled guilty to multiple charges and provided detailed testimony about the network's operations in exchange for a reduced sentence. Deputy Chief Bradley and Judge Brennan faced life sentences for their roles in trafficking children and corrupting the justice system. But for Emma and her family, the important healing had already begun. Sarah's recovery accelerated daily, aided by the knowledge that her daughter was safe and the trafficking network was destroyed. James would remain in witness protection until all trials were completed, but the family could finally begin planning a future together. 1 month later, Emma stood in the yard of their new home, a ranch house outside Cedar Falls where Bruno could roam freely on fenced acreage. The bear had become an official member of the Thompson family, his adoption papers signed by federal officials who recognized that separating him from Emma would be both cruel and counterproductive. "Bruno's my best friend forever," Emma announced to her parents as she showed the bear her latest drawing, a picture of their family standing together under a bright yellow sun. In the drawing, Bruno stood prominently beside Emma, no longer just a therapy animal but a beloved family member whose loyalty had saved them all. The nightmare was over. The healing had begun, and love, in all its unexpected forms, had triumphed over the darkest evil imaginable. Sometimes the most powerful voices come from the smallest souls, and the most unexpected friendships heal the deepest wounds. Emma's story reminds us that love doesn't always look the way we expect. It might come wrapped in fur, standing 320 pounds tall, with eyes that see truth when the rest of the world looks away. In a time when we often feel powerless against corruption and evil, a 3-year-old girl and her bear showed us that courage isn't about size or age. It's about speaking truth when it matters most. Their bond transcended every barrier that adults tried to build, proving that authentic connection can survive any attempt to destroy it. Emma found her voice through Bruno's unwavering loyalty, and together they exposed a darkness that had hidden behind respectable facades for far too long. Their story isn't just about justice served, it's about the healing power of unconditional love and the strength we find when someone or something believes in us completely. In our own lives, We all need that one relationship that makes us feel brave enough to speak our truth, strong enough to face our fears, and loved enough to believe that tomorrow can be better than today. What unlikely friendship in your own life has given you the courage to speak your truth? Have you ever witnessed a bond between a person and an animal that seemed to heal something words couldn't touch? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear how love showed up unexpectedly in your life.